probably goes from 1919, which would be a Unami, and as the other lodges were formed after that, other pins were from the 20s, and they went all the way up until about 1972. In 1972, Caldwell was officially discharged and not made the official jeweler for these pins. And the reason they went out in 1972 was that patches became so predominant and so popular that there was no market for the pins. There was no popularity or any demand for the pins, so the pins went out of business. So these, you might say, were before patches, and then for a while they coexisted at the same time with patches, and then after ultimately patches just took them over, and there were no more pins. So we can start anywhere. I'll show this one frame. This is one of 6 frames I have. I have about 70 pins total, and these pins took me about 7 or 8 years to compile this many. So they're few and far between, and there's not very many around, but they're not impossible. They can be found, and it takes a lot of looking, a lot of persistence to find them. I should say that we call them Caldwell pins. I probably referred to them as Caldwell pins. But there are actually more than one jeweler. Caldwell is one jeweler in Philadelphia, and that's the main one, and that's why they're called Caldwell pins. Caldwell took over in 1945. Before 1945, there was a jeweler named Jennings Hood. He was also in Philadelphia, and he had the same dies that Caldwell has. In fact, Caldwell bought his dies or took over his dies. So they're the same dies, but if you look on the back of the totem, turn them upside down, some of them say Caldwell, some of them say Hood. Some of them are not hallmarked at all, but that's not a problem. They're still good. It just means their quality control, some of them got out without being hallmarked. Hood pins are prior to 1945. Caldwell pins are after 1945. Most of them have chains and arrows. That's the tip-off. That's how you identify most of them. But there are some that don't. There are a few that don't. There's always an exception to the rule.
And so talk about, patches as far as being an insignia of the Order of the Arrow. That's probably something that comes after the pins. Can you talk a little bit about how these pins were sort of the early insignia of the Order of the Arrow, and then during the time that they were concurrent with patches, how they were still used, why lodges sold them, that kind of stuff?
Yes, in the early examples, which were before patches, they were the official insignia of the lodge in the sense of they were the only thing you could get. So you might say, well, the older ones are the rarer, but that's not necessarily true. The older ones might mean that there were more of them because they didn't have a choice. And we can point to several examples of that, like the beaver from Chapagat. Even though that's an old lodge and an old pin, there are relatively more beavers around than the average. And some of the pins from the 1960s, which you would think would be more prevalent, are actually some of the hardest ones to find. Well, let's back up to your question a little bit. These pins were designated for civilian wear more so than uniform wear. They went on blazers and collar lapels, sort of the same way a fraternity pin would do. In fact, I think these were copied from fraternity pin, that concept. And gradually, when patches came out, these pins were still available, but they concurrently lost their popularity because the patches were in color, they were cheaper, you could write on them and say what you wanted on a patch, but on a pin you don't have any room or any space to do that. So patches became much more popular, and these were an option. You didn't have to buy them, and if you did buy them, they were generally expensive, so they were either under the radar or not popular. Many people didn't want to do them. My own lodge, Blue Heron, we had pins when I was growing up as a kid in the 60s in the Order of the Arrow. I could have bought them for $12, and that would have been a wonderful deal when I look back on it from today.
But in 1960, what would $12 have bought you out of the lodge box? I mean, what was
a
lodge flap?
lot. $1.25.
$1.25.
$1.25 for a flap, and event patches and other things were maybe 50 or 75 cents, something like that. So most people opted for the patches, especially since they were tradable and they were in color and they were cheaper. And these pins were not really collected in those days. They were not something that transacted. It might have been an honor for a lodge chief or somebody or a lodge officer to receive one, or maybe an adult who had a lot of money. In our case, we're a Navy town, so they may have had some extra money from being in the Navy or being in the service. So, but very rarely did a regular average scout of scout age ever buy one of these things. So that contributes to its rarity also.
And where would they have, I know you mentioned it was a civilian wear thing. Do you find these on old merit badge sashes, or where do these things kind of turn up? These are some of the hardest items to find in the hobby today. These things are very obscure.
Correct.
Talk about that a little bit.
My experience has been that they're not with a box or bag of patches. If they were, that would be very unusual, and generally that's not the case. So you have to look elsewhere. Jewelry boxes are a good bet. Dresser drawers are a good bet. Even though they weren't for uniform wear, I have seen them on sashes once in a while. I don't think that was necessarily authorized that way, but sometimes you'll see them on a merit badge sash. That is possible. The other thing that is generally good is those old red Philmont jackets on the lapel of those, or on the breast of those, are red Philmont jackets. I've seen them sometimes. But they're not in with patches, and they're so small, they get lost, and they're not identifiable. They don't say on them what they are. So unless you knew what you had, or you knew what you were looking for, it might be that you come across them and you don't even know what they are.
Very hard to find.
Very hard.
Now, there are some differences as far as some of them are gold-plated and some of them are Brotherhood Vigil ones. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. The intention of these was that they all only be for Brotherhood and Vigil, because anybody who was ordeal was supposedly to get the universal arrow, which didn't have any chain on it and didn't have any totem on it. And those are very common. You can find those universal arrows.
This is the lapel pin. It looks,
yes,
yeah,
it looks like the same arrow that's on the chain, but it doesn't have a chain.
Yeah.
It's just the arrow itself. So,
were those made by Hood and Caldwell or somebody
yes,
else? Okay.
yes, those were also. It's also possible. I don't mean to not answer your question. I'll get to your question. It's also possible to have some. We talked about Caldwell and Hood. It's also possible to have local jewelers. Some lodges didn't necessarily have to go to Hood or Caldwell. They could have gone down the street, especially if they were in a big city, like Zitkalisha in Louisville used their own local jeweler and patterned their pin after a Caldwell pin, but they used, so it's possible to have local jewelers on these. But now back to your question. When Caldwell offered these, I'll show this price list here. They offer you the option of gold or silver. Now when we say gold, that could be solid gold. They did use that. Or it could be gold filled, which is gold plated. Both of those are considered gold. They also gave you the option of silver. Those are the two metals that they came in. Also on the order blank for Caldwell, you could check either Brotherhood or Vigil. The Brotherhood pins do not have a triangle on them. The Vigil pins do have a triangle. But Caldwell didn't care. If you sent them the money, they would send you whatever you
they wanted your
ordered.
business.
They wanted your business. So if you checked Vigil, even though you were not a Vigil, and you checked a totem that was not even your lodge, you could receive that. Caldwell would process that and send it to you in the mail. But nobody ever did that. Nobody ever did that.
Well, it kind of makes sense because they weren't, from their end, they weren't lodge specific.
No, that's
so it was
right.
like, I want the turtle vigil. Well, okay,
That's
here
right.
you go.
That's right.
What about, maybe I've heard this from you or from someone else before, about a minimum quantity in terms of how many, we talk about these pins being rare. Was it that, you had to order 6, maybe there's only 6 or 12 at a time or something?
Good question, and the answer is there was a restriction according to Caldwell's policy. If you didn't have at least an order of 12, you had to pay an extra die fee for them to construct the die. So everybody, at least for practical purposes, had a minimum order of 12, or each of these totems had an initial order somewhere along the line in the beginning of 12. Now they could have been reordered after that in onesies, or one at a time or two at a time. And the orders did not have to come from the lodge. The orders could come from individuals. The Caldwell didn't care, and I don't think the lodges cared. The record keeping was very poor. The documentation is very scanty and poor. So we really don't know how many were made of each of these. Some of them are one known, mostly in Bill Topkis' collection. Some of them are 2 known or 3 known. But there's still, or at least 12 of all of them.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't know where they are.
Right. They're still out there somewhere.
There's still 12 of them. And it's just that they're lost, or their survival rate, or wherever they are, is not to the advantage of finding them or being able to collect them.
What other kind of paperwork do you have that you can show us? I know that you've got some other things over here that...
Yes, I showed you the price list earlier. This is a advertising brochure from Caldwell. It lists or pictures some of their more common totems, certainly not all of them. Again, they were a business. They were trying to sell things, so they wanted to put on the ones that were the most popular, their biggest sellers. And it shows examples of the totems. It shows examples of the Vigil versus the Brotherhood, and it shows the universal arrow, which is the single arrow without the chain or the totem. Caldwell also made other jewelry items for the Order of the Arrow besides pins. They would make medals, they would make cufflinks or rings or charms or anything. If you wanted to pay the money and design it, they would make it for you and accommodate your wishes.
How have you guys been able to go back, since these were somewhat generic, go back and been able to sort of assign them to different lodges? I guess that's sort of a work in progress, probably.
That's one of the most difficult tasks. because the documentation is very poor, record keeping very poor. If a totem was unique to one lodge and no other, that's easy. For example, I have one pin in here that's 411, and it has the 411 right on it. It has an egret on it also, but I don't have to worry about it. I know it's from 411.
Right.
The problem comes in when you have beavers by lots of lodges, running deer by lots of lodges, and if possible, we try to get the provenance. In other words, if we can get the original owner, that's a good provenance. But frequently, it's not the original owner. It's somebody that got it from somebody else. And those you just have to either take their word for it or you have to guess. But it's not an exact science. And a lot of times we don't know. Let me mention one thing that is a corollary to your question. Here's an example. We have a running deer pin, sterling silver, Caldwell Brotherhood, from Lodge 33 Ajapute.
Right, okay.
And let's suppose right beside it we have a running deer pin, sterling silver, Caldwell Brotherhood, from 96 Tom Kitacharo. And we know the documentation, we know the provenance. That's really where both of them came from. Those pins are dupes. Now, that's different than patches. Patch traders are not trained to think that way. They think the lodge comes first. I've got a 33. That's different than a 96. Pin collectors don't think that way. They think it's a deer. No matter where it is a deer. When you're collecting the pin, if it's the same identical issue, regardless of where it's from, it's the same pin. You're collecting or you're buying or you're selling the pin, not the story. Now, it's nice to know where it came from, and we want to know what lodges had them. That's good to know, but in terms of pin collecting, the totem matters more than the lodge. And if you have the same totem from different lodges, it's a dupe.
Gotcha. Interesting. Now, tell me, let's go back and just ask, how did you get started in this? Because this is an area that I didn't even know about growing up and getting interested in patches. How did you get interested in collecting these?
Bill Topkis is the foremost in these pins and early lodge totem insignia, and he's the inspiration. He's the most knowledgeable, he has the most complete collection. He puts it on display at the Nowak Museum, and that was my beginning. I saw what he was doing, and I said, this is extraordinary because it goes to an earlier, deeper level than patches, and I'm not knocking patches. I think they're wonderful.
You are a patch collector and have
yes.
a great collection. But
I like patches,
I
yes.
can see the interest when you get to a stopping point with a patch collection where you just need a couple last ones, you can't find them. And then it's like someone has opened up another door for you.
That's well put. Very well put. So Bill was my starting place, and Bill has been very helpful in terms of sharing his knowledge and his expertise on the pins. And mostly after that, it's a matter of creating a network of people who know that you collect them. By that I mean most pins don't come to me firsthand. They're referred second or third hand or fourth hand down the road. Somebody knows somebody who knows somebody else. And there's no pattern to it. It's no rhyme or reason. It's hit or miss. Pins show up without any pattern or any thing that you could replicate. If we could replicate it, we would do it.
Right.
And
right.
we would find
So they just
them.
fall into your lap.
They just fall into your lap. I will say that in my case, and for most people's cases, if the opportunity comes along and it's not outrageous, you don't wait. You take them. You say, okay, I don't know when this will come around again.
Right.
So you go ahead and make that purchase, and sometimes you may think it's too expensive, but I've always thought it was worth it. I will say this about collecting them too. Some people ask me, how many people collect these? And the answer is two answers. People that want their own lodge or their own state, maybe, or their own section. Hundreds of people are like that.
Yeah.
We want ours. If you ask how many people want them from all over the country, probably the answer is 6 or 8 people. So, but you can always find local interest in that particular lodge.
Definitely.
Yes.
Well, how many do you think? Do you and Bill have a guesstimate as how many pins are out there, or what would someone be? Not that someone's going to just jump right into this, but give us an idea of the breadth of this collection. How many pins do you guys think are out there?
Well, that's always changing because we find new ones every year. You would think by now that we wouldn't find any new ones,
right.
But that's not true. New ones do show up, not a lot, but several a year. So the answer is growing. Again, I want to answer your question 2 different ways. If we talk about pins, we can talk about varieties of pins. We've already said gold or silver, Vigil or Brotherhood. So you could have, for a standard lodge totem, say a running deer, you could have 4 combinations. That would be 4 pins. But there's only 1 totem, 1 deer. So we think that if you count all the combinations, there's somewhere maybe between 325 or 350 known combinations of pins. When you talk about just the totem itself, a deer, a raccoon, those things, it's much less. And probably, I don't know, I'm guessing maybe 100 different totems so far. But I would also say that they are possible to find. Even the hard ones are possible to find. When I first started, I thought they were impossible. But they're not impossible. It can be done.
Right. And I think you've done a good job of, I've seen advertisements in the ISCA Journal and
yes.
flyers at Tritteries, just letting people
yes.
know I'm interested, so then it's a little bit of a magnet to bring them in.
Absolutely, and that's very important. You have to have all different kinds of avenues to let people know that you're interested in the pins. And after that, it's somewhat just good fortune and good luck.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, John, what I want to do now, we're going to stop this big shot video, and we're just going to take pictures of individual ones from your collection, and I'm going to let you talk about it.
Okay.
So I'm sure there's some beautiful pins here. People would love to see up close, and they want to hear your take on it. How about that?
Okay, of course. That'd be
Thanks.
great. Okay,
all right.
The first examples we're going to show are 2 pins from Unami Lodge of Philadelphia. These are turtle totems, and one of them is gold, one of them is silver. The gold one is a Brotherhood example. The silver one is a Vigil example. So that displays the different combinations that are possible. Of course, we've shown it in 2 pins. Actually, there's 4 possible combinations of gold and silver and Vigil and Brotherhood. So all 4 of those would be considered different pins in the realm of collecting them. The next pin I think you'll find interesting is a chipmunk, actually a squirrel die, but the chipmunk totem from Anarchist number 67 in Pennsylvania. The reason this one is important or particularly interesting is that it is a vigil, a gold, and a hood all on the same pin. Now, we talked about the difference between gold and silver. Actually, silvers are the standard, or you might say more common. None of these are common, but silvers are more common than gold. So gold is a premium or a little bump up than a silver. Also, vigils are a bump up from Brotherhood. That would make sense. There would be fewer vigils than Brotherhood. And finally, hood is a little bit of a bump up from Caldwell because it's earlier, and again, there were fewer of those. So it's very rare to find 3 premiums or 3 bump ups on the same pin. Most of the time you'll find either none or 1 or 2, but very rarely 3. But this pin displays all 3 premiums. The last pin example I would like to show you is a totem pin from Shawnee number 51 in St. Louis. It's a Thunderbird on an arrowhead. And the reason this one is interesting is that it does not have a chain and arrow, but the arrow is incorporated into the design of the totem itself. These type pins, which had the arrow incorporated into the totem itself, are called type 1 pins.